The silence in Marcus Chen's law office was deafening as Brian Thompson stared at the document in his hands, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, pure terror. The man who had strutted into this meeting 30 minutes ago, confident that his prenup would shield him from the financial storm he'd created, now sat frozen as the reality of Article 26's hidden asset penalty clause sank in. His wife Jessica sat across from him, her hands folded calmly in her lap, watching as the cocky real estate developer who had gambled away their future finally understood that his protection had become his downfall. "This can't be right," Brian whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "The prenup was supposed to protect me from debt liability. Bob assured me that Article 26 would keep Jessica's teacher salary separate from my business risks." He looked up at Marcus, desperation creeping into his eyes. "You can't just take everything I've built. This is my life's work." Jessica's voice was steady, almost gentle when she finally spoke. "Brian, you're absolutely right. Article 26 does protect against debt liability. But what you never bothered to read was the penalty clause for concealing over $100,000 in debts from your spouse. Turns out, when you lie about $300,000 in hidden liabilities, your separate assets don't stay separate anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." 4 years ago, Jessica Martinez never imagined she would be sitting in a lawyer's office watching her husband's empire crumble. Back then, she was a hopeful newlywed who believed in love, partnership, and building a life together. She had been teaching 3rd grade at Desert View Elementary for 6 years, coming home every day to her small apartment in Tempe, with lesson plans to grade and a quiet satisfaction that came from shaping young minds. Her life was simple but fulfilling, built on routine, responsibility, and the modest security that came from her $45,000 in savings, accumulated through years of careful budgeting and weekend bookkeeping work for her parents' small Mexican restaurant. Jessica had always been the responsible one in her family. While her sister Elena chased dreams of becoming an actress in Los Angeles, Jessica stayed grounded, literally and figuratively. She chose teaching not because it paid well, but because it gave her purpose. Every morning, she would arrive at school an hour early to prepare her classroom, ensuring her students had the best possible start to their day. Her colleagues respected her quiet competence, and parents specifically requested their children be placed in her class. She had built a reputation for being thorough, patient, and incredibly detail-oriented, qualities that would prove far more valuable than anyone could have imagined. Her accounting degree from Arizona State University was something she rarely mentioned to people. She had originally planned to become a CPA, but fell in love with teaching during her student teaching semester. Still, she maintained her accounting skills through continuing education courses and the bookkeeping work she did for local small businesses. Numbers made sense to Jessica in a way that people sometimes didn't. Financial statements told stories, and Jessica had always been good at reading between the lines of balance sheets and income statements. When she met Brian Thompson at a charity fundraiser for the school district, she was immediately drawn to his energy and ambition. He was everything she wasn't: outgoing, spontaneous, and full of grand plans for the future. Brian owned Thompson Development Group, a real estate development company that specialized in flipping houses in the rapidly growing Phoenix suburbs. He drove a gleaming white BMW, wore expensive suits, and had the kind of confidence that filled every room he entered. At 35, he was already talking about expanding into commercial properties and maybe even developing an entire subdivision. Their courtship was a whirlwind of expensive dinners, weekend trips to Sedona, and long conversations about their dreams. Brian would pick her up from school in his BMW, and Jessica would feel like she was living in a romantic movie. He would tell her about his latest property acquisition, his plans for renovation, and his vision for building something bigger than himself. Jessica found his passion infectious, even if she didn't fully understand the real estate business. She loved how he made her feel sophisticated and important, like she was part of something bigger than her quiet teacher's life. Brian's family had been in construction for generations, and he had grown up understanding the rhythm of building and renovation. His father had been a general contractor who worked on custom homes in Scottsdale, and Brian had spent his summers learning the trade. But where his father was conservative and methodical, Brian was aggressive and opportunistic. He saw the booming Phoenix real estate market as his chance to build something spectacular, to move beyond the steady but modest success of his father's business. Thompson Development Group had started small, with Brian flipping 2 houses in his first year. He had a natural eye for properties with potential, and he understood the suburban Phoenix market better than most. Young families were moving to Arizona in droves, drawn by the warm weather, relatively affordable housing, and growing job market. Brian positioned himself to meet that demand, buying distressed properties, renovating them quickly, and selling them to eager buyers who were willing to pay premium prices for move-in ready homes. By the time he met Jessica, Brian was flipping 6 to 8 houses per year and had partnered with Patricia Williams, a former mortgage broker who brought valuable connections and financing expertise to the business. Patty was sharp, experienced, and shared Brian's appetite for risk. Together, they had expanded Thompson Development Group's operations, taking on larger projects and more ambitious renovations. They were making serious money, and Brian was living the lifestyle he had always dreamed of. Their relationship moved quickly, perhaps too quickly in retrospect. Within 8 months of meeting, Brian had proposed to Jessica during a weekend getaway to the Grand Canyon. He had planned an elaborate proposal, complete with a private helicopter tour and a ring that cost more than Jessica made in 3 months. She said yes, caught up in the romance and excitement of it all, but part of her felt overwhelmed by the extravagance. Her parents had been married for 35 years, and their proposal story involved a simple ring and a quiet dinner at their favorite Mexican restaurant. But Jessica pushed aside her doubts, telling herself that different didn't mean wrong. The prenup came up 6 weeks before the wedding, presented as a practical necessity rather than a romantic obstacle. Brian explained that his business partner Patty had insisted on it, and that his lawyer Bob Anderson had drafted a comprehensive document that would protect both of them. Jessica remembered sitting in Bob's office, a generic corporate space in a downtown Phoenix high-rise, listening to him explain the various clauses and provisions. The language was dense and technical, full of legal terminology that made her head spin. Article 26 was buried on page 8 of the 12-page document, tucked between clauses about property management and inheritance rights. Bob had explained it as a debt liability protection clause, designed to ensure that if either party's business or personal financial decisions created problems, the other spouse would be protected from those consequences. It sounded reasonable, even thoughtful, like Brian was trying to protect her teacher's salary and modest savings from the risks inherent in his real estate business. Jessica had read the entire document carefully, using her accounting background to understand the financial implications as best she could. But legal language was different from accounting language, and some of the clauses seemed contradictory or unclear. When she asked questions, Bob would provide explanations that sounded logical but somehow didn't quite address her concerns. Brian was patient but clearly eager to move forward, and Jessica found herself signing the document more to avoid delaying the wedding than because she was completely comfortable with all the terms. The hidden asset penalty clause in Article 26 was written in particularly dense legal language, buried in a paragraph about disclosure requirements and fiduciary responsibilities. The key phrase read, "In the event that either party conceals liabilities exceeding $100,000 from the other party, said concealment shall constitute grounds for immediate conversion of all separate property to marital property, with automatic forfeiture of the concealing party's separate assets to the non-concealing party, as penalty for fraudulent misrepresentation of financial status." Jessica had read those words, but their implications hadn't been clear to her at the time. Bob had explained the clause as a protection against someone hiding major debts that could affect the marriage, but he had framed it as a mutual protection rather than a potential weapon. Neither Jessica nor Brian had focused on the penalty aspect of the clause, assuming it would never be relevant to their situation. Their wedding was beautiful, held at the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix with 200 guests and enough flowers to stock a small nursery. Brian had insisted on paying for everything, despite Jessica's parents' attempts to contribute. It was a celebration of their future together, full of hope and promise. Jessica's students had made her a special card with their handprints, and several parents had traveled from out of state to attend. Brian's business associates filled several tables, and Patty Williams gave a toast about how lucky Brian was to find someone who would keep him grounded. The first year of marriage was everything Jessica had hoped for. They bought a beautiful 4-bedroom house in Ahwatukee, a master-planned community with tree-lined streets and mountain views. Brian's business was thriving, and he was talking about expanding into commercial properties. Jessica loved their new home, with its open floor plan and spacious backyard perfect for entertaining. She set up a home office where she could work on lesson plans and continue her small bookkeeping practice. But subtle changes began to appear in their second year of marriage. Brian was working longer hours, staying late at job sites, and spending more time with Patty discussing new opportunities. He became more secretive about his business dealings, explaining that real estate development involved confidential negotiations and competitive strategies that required discretion. Jessica understood that his business was more complex than teaching, but she began to feel shut out of an important part of his life. The Phoenix real estate market was becoming increasingly competitive, with more developers entering the market and buyers becoming more selective. Brian and Patty responded by taking on more ambitious projects, purchasing larger properties, and planning more extensive renovations. They were making more money per project, but they were also taking on more risk and requiring more capital. Brian started talking about leveraging their success to grow faster, about striking while the market was hot. Jessica noticed that Brian's spending habits were becoming more extravagant. He bought a new BMW for himself and insisted on getting Jessica a luxury SUV she didn't need. He started shopping at expensive stores and buying gadgets and toys that seemed unnecessary. When Jessica gently questioned some of the purchases, Brian would dismiss her concerns, explaining that they needed to look successful to attract the best clients and projects. Image was important in real estate, he would say, and they could afford to enjoy their success. Their social life began to revolve around Brian's business connections. They attended real estate industry events, charity galas, and networking functions, where Jessica often felt out of place among the other wives, many of whom didn't work outside the home and seemed to live in a different financial universe. Jessica enjoyed meeting new people, but she sometimes felt like she was performing a role rather than being herself. Brian was always charming and attentive at these events, but Jessica began to notice that he was different at home, more distracted, and sometimes irritable about small things. By their third year of marriage, Jessica was beginning to see cracks in the facade. Brian's mood swings were becoming more frequent, and he was drinking more than usual. He would come home late, pour himself a large scotch, and spend hours on his phone dealing with what he called business emergencies. When Jessica tried to talk to him about her concerns, he would either brush her off or become defensive, accusing her of not understanding the pressures of running a business. The real estate market was showing signs of strain. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Interest rates were rising, and some of the speculative developments that had driven the boom were starting to look overextended. Brian and Patty were finding it harder to sell their completed properties, and they were having to reduce prices to attract buyers. Projects that should have sold within weeks were sitting on the market for months, tying up capital and creating cash flow problems. Jessica began to notice that Brian was receiving calls from banks and creditors, conversations that he would take in private and that seemed to leave him agitated. He started checking his phone obsessively, even during dinner or while watching television. When Jessica asked if everything was okay, Brian would assure her that it was just normal business stress, that every developer went through rough patches, and that their strong track record would carry them through. But Jessica's accounting training made her sensitive to financial stress, and she could see signs that Brian was trying to hide. Bills were sometimes paid late, and she noticed that some of their credit card statements showed balances that seemed inconsistent with their lifestyle. When she offered to help with the family finances, Brian declined, saying that he preferred to handle money matters himself and that she was too busy with her teaching responsibilities. The discovery that would change everything came during tax preparation season in their fourth year of marriage. Jessica had always done their personal taxes, partly because she enjoyed the work, and partly because it helped her understand their overall financial picture. She had her own tax software and had developed a systematic approach to organizing their financial documents. Brian would provide her with the business information she needed, and she would handle the rest. But this year, Brian seemed reluctant to provide his business documents. He kept saying he was too busy to gather everything, that tax season was always stressful, and that maybe they should hire a professional accountant to handle their taxes. Jessica found his resistance strange, since she had been doing their taxes successfully for years and had never made any mistakes that cost them money. Finally, Jessica decided to gather the documents herself. She knew where Brian kept his business files, and she had helped him organize his home office when they first moved into the house. She wasn't trying to snoop or spy. She was simply trying to be helpful and get their taxes done on time. But what she found in Brian's filing cabinet made her blood run cold. Mixed in with legitimate business documents were loan agreements, credit card statements, and promissory notes that revealed the true scope of Brian's financial situation. He had been systematically borrowing money to fund the business expansion, using personal guarantees and pledging assets that Jessica didn't even know existed. The numbers were staggering. $150,000 in personal credit card debt, $130,000 in business loans that he had personally guaranteed, and $25,000 borrowed from private investors. Jessica sat in Brian's office, surrounded by documents that painted a picture of financial recklessness and deception. Her husband, the man who had promised to protect her from financial risk, had been gambling with their future and hiding the consequences from her. The prenup that was supposed to protect them both had been based on lies, and Jessica was beginning to understand that she had been living in a carefully constructed illusion. The worst part wasn't just the money, though $300,000 in hidden debt was certainly terrifying. The worst part was the realization that Brian had been lying to her for years, had been making decisions that affected their future without including her, and had been treating her like a child who couldn't handle adult responsibilities. Every conversation about their finances, every reassurance about their security, every dismissal of her concerns had been built on deception. Jessica spent the next several hours methodically reviewing every document, using her accounting skills to build a complete picture of their financial situation. She created spreadsheets, calculated debt-to-income ratios, and analyzed cash flow projections. The numbers told a story of a business that was overextended, over-leveraged, and headed for serious trouble. Brian and Patty had been using debt to fund expansion, betting that the real estate market would continue to rise and that they could sell their way out of their obligations. But the market was softening, and their latest projects were not selling as quickly as projected. Interest payments were consuming more and more of their cash flow, and they were having to borrow additional money just to meet their existing obligations. It was a classic debt spiral, and Jessica could see that they were running out of options. As she sat in the quiet of Brian's office, surrounded by the evidence of his deception, Jessica felt something shift inside her. The hurt and betrayal were overwhelming, but underneath those emotions was something else. A cold, analytical clarity that came from her accounting training. She began to think about the prenup, about Article 26, and about the legal implications of what she had discovered. Jessica retrieved their prenup from the safe and read Article 26 again, this time with full knowledge of Brian's hidden debts. The language that had seemed protective now looked like something else entirely. The hidden asset penalty clause wasn't just about protecting spouses from each other's debts. It was about punishing deception and fraud. Brian had concealed over $300,000 in liabilities from her, far exceeding the $100,000 threshold that would trigger the penalty clause. She spent the rest of the night researching Arizona community property law, marital debt obligations, and the legal precedents for prenup enforcement. What she discovered was that Brian's attempt to protect himself from debt liability had actually created a mechanism for his own financial destruction. By hiding his debts, he had violated the fundamental honesty requirement that made the prenup valid. And the penalty for that violation was the forfeiture of his separate assets to her. Thompson Development Group, Brian's share of their house, his investment accounts, even his precious BMW, everything he had tried to protect with the prenup was now legally vulnerable. The man who had thought he was so clever, who had believed he could have his cake and eat it too, had actually created the perfect trap for himself. Jessica closed the documents and sat back in Brian's expensive office chair, looking around at the trappings of success that had all been built on borrowed money and false promises. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of calm. She knew what she had to do, and she knew she had the skills and knowledge to do it right. Brian had underestimated her. had seen her as a simple schoolteacher who couldn't understand complex financial matters. He was about to learn just how wrong he had been. The next morning, Jessica called in sick to school for the first time in 2 years. She spent the day making phone calls, gathering additional documentation, and preparing for what was to come. She contacted Marcus Chen, a divorce attorney who specialized in complex financial cases, and scheduled a consultation. She also called her sister Elena, who immediately offered to fly in from Los Angeles to provide emotional support. Jessica's plan was methodical and careful, just like everything else she did. She would not confront Brian until she had all the facts, all the documentation, and all the legal support she needed. She would not let emotion cloud her judgment or allow him to manipulate her with promises and explanations. She had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her that this was about more than money. It was about respect, honesty, and the kind of person she wanted to be. The woman who had signed that prenup 4 years ago had been trusting, hopeful, and perhaps a little naive. But the woman who was now planning her response was stronger, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous than Brian could possibly imagine. He had created this situation with his lies and his greed, and now he would have to live with the consequences. Jessica Martinez was about to remind him that underestimating a third-grade teacher with an accounting degree was a very expensive mistake. Jessica knew that what came next would require patience, precision, and a level of strategic thinking that her years in the classroom had taught her, but that Brian had never bothered to recognize. As she sat in the early morning darkness of their kitchen, sipping coffee and reviewing the documents spread across their granite countertop, she understood that this wasn't just about recovering from betrayal. This was about justice, about ensuring that the man who had built his success on lies and manipulation would finally face the consequences of his choices. The prenup that Brian thought protected him was about to become the instrument of his downfall, and Jessica was going to make sure that every detail was executed flawlessly. The transformation that was coming wouldn't be dramatic or sudden. Jessica had learned from years of managing third graders that the most effective changes happened gradually, systematically, and with careful attention to cause and effect. Brian had spent years underestimating her, seeing her as the quiet teacher wife who smiled at his business associates and asked simple questions about his work. He had no idea that behind that patient exterior was a woman who understood financial systems, legal obligations, and the power of thorough preparation. Jessica's first step was to understand exactly what Brian owned and what he owed, down to the last penny. Her accounting background had taught her that accurate information was the foundation of every good decision, and she wasn't going to proceed until she had a complete picture of their financial reality. Over the next several days, she systematically gathered documentation, not just from Brian's home office, but from every source she could access legally and ethically. She started with their joint accounts and shared financial obligations, areas where she had legitimate access and could gather information without raising suspicion. Their mortgage statements revealed that Brian had refinanced their house 6 months earlier, pulling out equity that Jessica hadn't known about. The home equity loan documents showed that he had borrowed an additional $75,000 against their house, money that had supposedly gone into business expansion, but that Jessica couldn't trace to any specific legitimate business expense. Their credit card statements told an even more troubling story. Brian had been using their joint cards to cover business expenses that should have been handled through Thompson Development Group's business accounts. Cash advances, equipment purchases, contractor payments, and even some personal expenses for Patty Williams had been charged to their personal cards. Jessica calculated that over $18,000 in charges on their joint accounts were actually business expenses that Brian had been hiding from his business partner. The bank statements revealed a pattern of transfers between accounts that made no sense from a legitimate business perspective. Money would move from their joint checking account to Brian's personal account, then to the business account, then back to his personal account, creating a confusing trail that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify financial flows. Jessica recognized this as a classic sign of someone trying to juggle multiple financial obligations without enough capital to meet them all. But the most damning evidence came from documents that Jessica found in Brian's car. He had been careless, leaving bank statements and loan paperwork in his BMW's glove compartment and center console. These documents revealed the true scope of his financial desperation. Personal loans from 3 different banks, each secured with different assets, and each carrying interest rates that suggested Brian was considered a high-risk borrower. Credit lines from equipment financing companies, secured by construction tools and machinery that Jessica had never seen or heard mentioned. The private investor loans were the most troubling discovery. $25,000 borrowed from individuals whose names Jessica didn't recognize, at interest rates that bordered on predatory. The loan agreements were handwritten, unprofessional, and included personal guarantees that put their house and other assets at risk. These weren't legitimate business loans from established lenders. These were desperate borrowing arrangements that suggested Brian was running out of conventional financing options. As Jessica pieced together the full financial picture, she began to understand the psychology behind Brian's deception. He had started with small loans and credit lines, probably telling himself that they were temporary measures to smooth out cash flow problems. But as the real estate market became more competitive and their projects took longer to sell, those temporary measures had become permanent obligations. Rather than scaling back or seeking help, Brian had doubled down, borrowing more money to service existing debts and maintain the appearance of success. The business partnership with Patty Williams added another layer of complexity to the situation. Jessica discovered that Brian had been hiding some of his personal borrowing from Patty, just as he had been hiding it from Jessica. The partnership agreement included clauses about personal guarantees and financial disclosure, and Brian's secret borrowing violated several of those provisions. If Patty discovered the true extent of Brian's personal debts, she could potentially dissolve the partnership and demand immediate repayment of business loans that Brian couldn't possibly cover. Jessica realized that Brian was trapped in a web of obligations that was becoming impossible to maintain. He owed money to banks, credit card companies, private investors, and business creditors, all while trying to maintain the lifestyle and appearance that he believed were necessary for his business success. The monthly payments on his various debts were consuming most of his income, leaving him with very little actual cash flow despite the apparent success of Thompson Development Group. The real estate market downturn was making everything worse. Properties that Brian and Patty had expected to sell within 60 days were sitting on the market for 4 or 5 months, tying up capital and creating cash flow crunches that forced Brian to borrow even more money. The carrying costs on their unsold inventory were enormous, and Jessica could see that they were approaching a point where they wouldn't be able to service their debts, even if they sold every property they currently owned. But Brian's biggest mistake wasn't financial. It was personal. He had systematically excluded Jessica from every major decision that affected their future, treating her like a junior partner in her own marriage. He had signed loan documents that put their house at risk without consulting her. He had made business decisions that affected their personal credit without informing her. He had committed them to financial obligations that could destroy their future without giving her any voice in those choices. The prenup that Brian thought protected him had actually created a legal framework for Jessica to reclaim control. Article 26's hidden asset penalty clause wasn't just about punishing deception. It was about restoring balance to a relationship where one party had abused their financial power. By concealing over $300,000 in debts, Brian had triggered a provision that would transfer his separate assets to Jessica as compensation for his fraudulent misrepresentation of their financial status. Jessica spent hours researching similar cases in Arizona courts, looking for precedents and legal strategies that would help her understand how Article 26 might be enforced. What she discovered was that Arizona judges took financial deception in marriage very seriously, particularly when one spouse had used their business or professional position to hide assets or liabilities from the other. The state's community property laws were designed to ensure fairness and transparency in marital finances, and Brian's actions violated the fundamental principles that made those laws work. The hidden asset penalty clause in their prenup was actually quite sophisticated, drafted in a way that would be difficult to challenge or overturn. Bob Anderson, Brian's lawyer, had apparently included the clause as a standard protection, never imagining that his own client would be the one to trigger it. The penalty was severe automatic forfeiture of separate assets, but it was also precisely defined, with clear thresholds and specific procedures that would make it enforceable in court. Jessica began to understand that her accounting background gave her significant advantages in this situation. She could analyze financial documents, trace money flows, and build a comprehensive case that would be difficult for Brian to dispute or explain away. Her years of bookkeeping work had taught her how to organize complex financial information in ways that judges and lawyers could easily understand. She could present evidence systematically, logically, and persuasively. But more importantly, Jessica's teaching experience had given her something that Brian had never developed: patience and strategic thinking. She had spent years dealing with difficult children, manipulative parents, and complex classroom dynamics. She understood how to remain calm under pressure, how to plan for multiple contingencies, and how to achieve long-term goals through careful, consistent effort. Brian's approach to problems was typically aggressive and short-term. When faced with financial pressure, he borrowed more money. When confronted with market challenges, he took bigger risks. When questioned about his decisions, he became defensive and dismissive. He had succeeded in business partly because of his willingness to take risks, but he had never learned to think beyond the immediate problem or to consider the long-term consequences of his actions. Jessica's approach would be completely different. She would gather all the facts, understand all the options, and then execute a plan that would achieve lasting results. She wouldn't act out of anger or hurt feelings. She would act based on logic, evidence, and a clear understanding of what she wanted to accomplish. Brian had taught her, through his own behavior, that emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford in this situation. The first phase of Jessica's plan involved documenting everything. She created detailed spreadsheets that tracked every debt, every asset, and every financial transaction she could identify. She photographed documents, saved electronic records, and built a comprehensive file that would support her case. She was meticulous and systematic, approaching the task with the same attention to detail that she brought to lesson planning and student assessment. Jessica also began to research divorce law in Arizona, focusing specifically on cases involving financial deception and prenup enforcement. She discovered that the state's courts had consistently upheld prenup provisions that included penalty clauses for financial misconduct, particularly when one spouse had used their professional expertise to hide assets or liabilities from the other. The legal precedents strongly supported her position, and she began to feel confident that Article 26 would be enforceable. But Jessica knew that legal precedent was only part of the equation. She would also need to demonstrate that Brian's deception had caused her actual harm, that his hidden debts had put her at financial risk, and that the penalty clause was a reasonable response to his misconduct. This would require not just documentation of his debts, but also analysis of how those debts affected their joint financial position and her personal security. The community property laws in Arizona meant that Brian's debts could potentially become Jessica's responsibility, even if she had no knowledge of them. Creditors could pursue their joint assets, including their house, to satisfy Brian's personal obligations. The fact that Jessica had been excluded from the decisions that created these risks actually strengthened her case for penalty enforcement, since she had been unable to protect herself from consequences she didn't know existed. Jessica's research also revealed that Brian's business partner, Patty, might become an ally in her efforts to recover assets. If Patty discovered that Brian had been hiding personal debts that could affect the business, she would have strong incentives to distance herself from Brian's personal financial problems. The partnership agreement included provisions that would allow Patty to buy out Brian's share of the business if his personal conduct threatened the company's financial stability. As Jessica continued her research and planning, she began to see the shape of a strategy that would not only protect her from Brian's debts, but actually leave her in a stronger financial position than when they had married. The hidden asset penalty clause could transfer ownership of Brian's share of Thompson Development Group to her, along with his other investments and assets. Combined with her own savings and the equity in their house, She could emerge from this crisis with enough resources to build a completely independent life. But Jessica also understood that success would require more than just legal knowledge and financial analysis. She would need to remain calm and focused while Brian continued to lie to her. She would need to gather evidence without alerting him to her plans. She would need to prepare for a confrontation that would likely be explosive and emotionally devastating. Most importantly, she would need to trust in her own judgment and abilities, even when everyone around her might question her decisions. The woman who had signed that prenup 4 years earlier had trusted Brian to be honest with her, to include her in important decisions, and to protect their shared interests. That trust had been systematically violated, and Jessica was beginning to understand that the naive hopefulness that had characterized her early marriage was gone forever. In its place was something harder, more calculating, but ultimately more powerful. A determination to take control of her own destiny and to ensure that Brian's lies and manipulation would finally have consequences. Jessica spent the next several weeks carefully gathering additional evidence while maintaining the appearance of normalcy in their daily life. She continued teaching, continued managing their household finances, and continued playing the role of the supportive wife who trusted her husband to handle their business affairs. But behind that facade, she was systematically building a case that would demolish Brian's financial empire and transfer its remains to her. The psychological toll of living with such elaborate deception was enormous. Every conversation with Brian felt like a performance. Every social interaction required careful management of information, and every day brought new discoveries that deepened her understanding of how thoroughly she had been betrayed. But Jessica had learned to compartmentalize her emotions, to focus on the tasks that needed to be completed, rather than the feelings that threatened to overwhelm her. She found strength in the routine of her work, in the simple honesty of her relationships with her students, and in the growing certainty that she was doing the right thing. Brian had made his choices, had created this situation through his own greed and dishonesty, and now he would have to live with the results. Jessica was simply ensuring that those results included consequences for her as well as for him. The final piece of Jessica's preparation involved assembling a legal team that could handle the complex financial and contractual issues that would arise when she finally confronted Brian with what she had discovered. She interviewed several divorce attorneys before settling on Marcus Chen, a lawyer who specialized in high-asset divorces and prenup enforcement. Marcus had experience with cases involving business partnerships, real estate investments, and complex debt structures, and he immediately grasped the significance of Article 26's penalty provisions. Marcus explained to Jessica that her case was stronger than most, partly because of the clear evidence of deception, and partly because of the sophisticated penalty clause that Brian's own lawyer had included in their prenup. The automatic forfeiture provision meant that they wouldn't have to negotiate or litigate over asset division. Brian's hidden debts had already triggered the consequences spelled out in their original agreement. But Marcus also warned Jessica that Brian would likely fight the penalty enforcement, probably claiming that he hadn't understood the implications of Article 26, or that his debts were legitimate business expenses, rather than hidden personal liabilities. Brian's lawyer would undoubtedly argue that the penalty was excessive, or that the deception wasn't serious enough to justify forfeiture of assets. Jessica would need to be prepared for a legal battle that could last months and cost tens of thousands of dollars. Jessica listened to Marcus's warnings with the same calm attention she brought to parent conferences and administrative meetings. She understood that Brian wouldn't give up easily, that he would use every legal and emotional tactic available to avoid the consequences of his actions. But she also understood that she held the stronger position, both legally and factually. Brian's own documents condemned him. His own lawyer's careful drafting had created the mechanism for his punishment, and his own behavior had provided overwhelming evidence of deception and bad faith. As Jessica prepared for the confrontation that would end her marriage and begin her new life, she reflected on how much she had changed since discovering Brian's lies. The trusting, hopeful woman who had signed that prenup was gone, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more self-reliant. Brian had taught her valuable lessons about human nature, about the importance of financial independence, and about the danger of trusting someone else to protect her interests. Those lessons had come at a terrible personal cost, but Jessica was determined to ensure that they wouldn't be wasted. She would use what she had learned to build a better life, to help other women avoid similar betrayals, and to demonstrate that underestimating a quiet, methodical person was always a mistake. Brian Thompson was about to discover that his clever prenup had created not a shield, but a sword, and that the woman he had dismissed as a simple school teacher was actually his most dangerous opponent. The psychological warfare that Brian had been waging against Jessica intensified as his financial pressures mounted, though he remained completely unaware that his wife was documenting every manipulation tactic he employed. What Brian saw as necessary damage control, Jessica recognized as a systematic campaign to isolate her from information and decision-making that affected her own future. His methods were sophisticated, leveraging social expectations about marriage roles and exploiting Jessica's natural tendency to avoid conflict. But every conversation, every deflection, and every attempt to minimize her concerns was being carefully cataloged by a woman who understood far more about financial analysis and legal consequences than her husband had ever bothered to discover. Brian's primary strategy involved controlling the narrative around their financial situation. Whenever Jessica asked questions about their mounting expenses or the late-night phone calls he was receiving, Brian would frame his responses in terms of business complexity that she supposedly couldn't understand. He would explain that real estate development involved sophisticated financial instruments, that temporary cash flow challenges were normal in their industry, and that her teaching background hadn't prepared her to grasp the nuances of leveraged investment strategies. His tone was always patient, almost condescending, as if he were explaining advanced concepts to a child. The manipulation extended beyond simple deflection to active misdirection. When Jessica expressed concern about their increasing credit card balances, Brian would assure her that those charges were strategic business expenses that would generate tax advantages and improve their overall financial position. He would show her carefully selected documents that supported his explanations, while keeping the more damaging paperwork hidden in his office safe. Jessica began to realize that Brian had been curating her access to information for years, showing her only what supported the story he wanted her to believe. Brian's brother Danny became an unwitting accomplice in the deception, though Jessica suspected that Danny knew more about Brian's financial troubles than he was admitting. During family gatherings, Danny would make comments about Brian's business acumen and success, reinforcing the image that Brian was trying to maintain. When Jessica would express concerns about their lifestyle or spending patterns, Danny would remind her how lucky she was to be married to such a successful entrepreneur. These interventions felt coordinated, as if Brian had coached his brother on what to say and when to say it. The social pressure extended to their circle of friends and business associates. Brian had cultivated relationships with other successful couples in their community, and he used these connections to reinforce his position as the financial expert in their marriage. At dinner parties and social events, conversations would naturally turn to business and investments, areas where Brian could demonstrate his expertise while Jessica's teaching profession was politely acknowledged but clearly considered less sophisticated. The wives in their social circle often didn't work outside the home or had careers that were seen as hobbies rather than serious professions. Jessica began to notice how Brian would steer conversations away from topics where she might have valuable insights. When discussions turned to children's education, local school politics, or community issues where Jessica's experience was relevant, Brian would quickly redirect the conversation back to real estate, business development, or investment strategies. He was systematically diminishing her voice in their social circle, ensuring that she was seen as the supportive spouse rather than an equal partner with her own expertise and opinions. The financial manipulation became more subtle and insidious as Brian's desperation grew. He began asking Jessica to sign documents without providing adequate time for review, often presenting them during busy periods when she was grading papers or preparing lesson plans. He would explain that these were routine financial forms, tax documents, or administrative paperwork that required both signatures for bureaucratic reasons. Jessica would sign these documents while distracted, trusting that Brian was handling their affairs competently and honestly. One particularly manipulative incident occurred when Brian asked Jessica to co-sign a business loan application. He presented it as a formality, explaining that the bank required spousal signatures on all business loans, even though the debt would be entirely Brian's responsibility. He assured Jessica that the prenup protected her from any liability, and that her signature was simply a procedural requirement. Jessica signed the document, not realizing that she was actually guaranteeing a $50,000 loan that Brian was using to cover personal debts rather than legitimate business expenses. Brian's control over their financial information became increasingly sophisticated as his situation deteriorated. He switched their bank statements to electronic delivery and changed the passwords on their online accounts, claiming that paperless banking was more secure and environmentally responsible. He began handling all their mail personally, sorting through financial documents before Jessica could see them, and disposing of anything that might raise questions about their true financial position. Jessica noticed these changes but didn't initially recognize them as deliberate information control tactics. The emotional manipulation was perhaps even more damaging than the financial deception. Brian began questioning Jessica's judgment on small matters, undermining her confidence in ways that made her less likely to challenge his decisions on important issues. He would criticize her spending on classroom supplies, suggesting that she was being too generous with money that could be better used elsewhere. He would second-guess her teaching methods and question her professional decisions, making her feel defensive and uncertain about areas where she had previously felt competent and confident. Brian's treatment of Jessica in front of others became increasingly dismissive. He would interrupt her when she was speaking, finish her sentences, or correct her on matters where she was actually more knowledgeable than he was. At business functions, he would introduce her as, "My wife Jessica, she's a teacher," in a tone that suggested her profession was charming but irrelevant. When she would try to contribute to conversations about financial planning or business strategy, Brian would politely but firmly redirect the discussion, suggesting that these topics were outside her area of expertise. The isolation tactics extended to Jessica's relationship with her own family. Brian began declining invitations to visit Jessica's parents in Tucson, claiming that business pressures made it difficult for him to take time away from Phoenix. When Jessica's sister Elena would call with concerns about Brian's behavior or their lifestyle changes, Brian would encourage Jessica to limit those conversations, suggesting that Elena was jealous of their success and was trying to create problems in their marriage. He positioned himself as the reasonable voice protecting their relationship from outside interference. Brian's manipulation of their social calendar was particularly effective at isolating Jessica from potential sources of support and alternative perspectives. He would schedule business events and networking functions during times when Jessica might otherwise spend time with her teacher colleagues or old friends. He would encourage her to attend these business functions with him, positioning it as important for her to understand his work and meet his professional contacts. But at these events, Jessica found herself surrounded by people who reinforced Brian's narrative about success, lifestyle, and the proper roles of spouses in business relationships. The financial pressure on Brian was creating increasingly erratic behavior that Jessica was beginning to recognize as signs of serious stress. He would have explosive reactions to minor inconveniences, such as traffic delays or restaurant service problems. His drinking increased significantly, and he began staying up late into the night, supposedly working on business plans but actually researching loan options and debt consolidation strategies. His sleep patterns became irregular, and he was often exhausted and irritable during the day. Jessica noticed that Brian's relationship with his business partner, Patty, was becoming strained. Phone conversations that had once been collaborative and energetic now sounded tense and argumentative. Brian would take these calls in private, but Jessica could hear raised voices and what sounded like disagreements about money and strategy. When she asked about these conversations, Brian would dismiss them as normal business tensions, but Jessica could see that the partnership that had been the foundation of his success was beginning to fracture. The real estate market downturn was creating external pressures that Brian could no longer hide completely. Properties that Thompson Development Group had expected to sell quickly were sitting on the market for months, and Brian was having to reduce prices substantially to attract buyers. The carrying costs on these unsold properties were enormous, and Jessica could see that Brian was struggling to maintain the cash flow necessary to service their construction loans and business debts. Brian's attempts to maintain his lifestyle and business image became increasingly desperate and costly. He would rent expensive cars for important business meetings when his BMW was being serviced, claiming that image was crucial in real estate negotiations. He insisted on dining at upscale restaurants when entertaining potential clients, even though Jessica could see that these expenses were straining their personal finances. He continued to buy expensive clothes and accessories, justifying these purchases as necessary investments in his professional appearance. The credit card statements that Jessica was allowed to see showed increasing balances and minimum payments that were consuming larger portions of their monthly income. When Jessica expressed concern about these balances, Brian would explain that they were temporarily higher due to business cash flow timing, and that major payments were coming that would reduce their debt levels. But Jessica's accounting background allowed her to see that the minimum payments were barely covering interest charges, and that their total debt was growing rather than shrinking. Brian's behavior toward Jessica's career became increasingly undermining as his own professional situation deteriorated. He began suggesting that her teaching salary was insignificant compared to his business income, and that she might consider reducing her work hours or taking a sabbatical to focus on supporting his business activities. He claimed that other successful wives in their social circle had made similar choices, prioritizing their husbands' careers over their own professional development. Jessica recognized this as an attempt to make her more financially dependent on him and less likely to question his decisions. The manipulation reached a new level when Brian began involving Jessica in his business presentations and client meetings, not as an equal partner, but as a prop to demonstrate his stability and success. He would coach her on what to say and how to behave, emphasizing the importance of projecting confidence and prosperity. Jessica found herself playing a role in promoting investments and business opportunities that she didn't fully understand, while Brian assured her that her presence was crucial for establishing trust with potential partners and investors. But Brian's most serious miscalculation was his assumption that Jessica's quiet, supportive demeanor reflected a lack of intelligence or capability, rather than simply a different personality style and professional focus. He had spent years dismissing her analytical skills, her attention to detail, and her ability to understand complex information. He saw her as someone who needed protection from adult responsibilities, rather than someone who might be capable of handling those responsibilities better than he was. Jessica's discovery of Brian's true financial situation had revealed not just the extent of his debts, but also the sophisticated nature of his deception and manipulation. She began to understand that his behavior patterns represented a systematic effort to control her access to information and decision-making power. Every conversation about money, every deflection of her concerns, and every appeal to her trust had been part of a calculated strategy to maintain his control over their financial future. The realization that she had been living with such elaborate psychological manipulation was devastating, but it also activated analytical capabilities that Brian had never recognized or respected. Jessica's teaching experience had given her extensive training in recognizing manipulation tactics, understanding power dynamics, and responding to complex behavioral challenges. Her accounting background had taught her to trace financial flows, identify discrepancies, and build comprehensive pictures from incomplete information. As Jessica continued her secret investigation into Brian's financial activities, she began to understand that her unique combination of skills and experience made her far more dangerous to his plans than he could possibly imagine. Her teaching career had required her to manage complex budgets, understand legal compliance requirements, and communicate effectively with parents, administrators, and colleagues who often had conflicting interests and agendas. Her bookkeeping work had given her practical experience with business finances, tax preparation, and the legal requirements for financial documentation and reporting. Jessica's educational background included coursework in educational psychology, child development, and classroom management, all of which had given her sophisticated understanding of human behavior, motivation, and the techniques that people use to influence and control others. She recognized many of Brian's manipulation tactics from her professional training, and she understood how to document and respond to systematic attempts to undermine someone's confidence and decision-making ability. The accounting degree that Jessica rarely mentioned had actually included significant coursework in forensic accounting, business law, and financial fraud detection. She had learned to analyze complex financial documents, trace money flows through multiple accounts and entities, and identify the warning signs of financial misconduct. These skills had been dormant during her teaching career, but they were perfectly suited to the challenge of understanding and documenting Brian's financial deception. Jessica's experience with difficult parents and administrative challenges had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to document interactions carefully, and to build compelling cases for her professional decisions. She understood how to gather evidence systematically, how to present complex information clearly, and how to anticipate and respond to attempts to discredit or dismiss her concerns. These skills, developed over years of classroom management and parent conferences, were directly applicable to the legal and financial challenges she now faced. But perhaps most importantly, Jessica's years of working with children had taught her to recognize when someone was lying, to understand the psychology of people who tried to avoid consequences for their actions, and to respond to manipulation with patience and strategic thinking, rather than emotional reactions. Brian's attempts to control and deceive her were sophisticated by his standards, but they were transparent to someone who had spent years dealing with much more creative and persistent attempts at manipulation from students who were trying to avoid homework, deflect responsibility, or gain advantages they hadn't earned. Jessica realized that Brian had fundamentally misunderstood her personality and capabilities. He had seen her quiet professionalism as passivity, her collaborative approach as weakness, and her trust as naivety. He had assumed that her choice to focus on teaching rather than pursuing a high-income career reflected limited ambition or ability rather than different values and priorities. His entire strategy for controlling their relationship had been based on incorrect assumptions about who she was and what she was capable of accomplishing. The financial documentation that Jessica had been gathering painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond simple overspending or poor business decisions. Brian had been deliberately hiding information, manipulating documents, and creating false impressions about their financial situation for years. The prenup that he thought protected him had actually created a legal framework for Jessica to reclaim control and seek compensation for his fraudulent behavior. Article 26's hidden asset penalty clause was more sophisticated than either Jessica or Brian had initially understood. The penalty provisions included not just asset forfeiture, but also potential claims for damages related to the deception itself. Jessica's research had revealed that Arizona courts had awarded substantial penalties in cases involving financial fraud between spouses, particularly when one party had used their professional expertise to hide assets or liabilities from the other. The evidence that Jessica had gathered would support not only enforcement of the penalty clause, but also additional claims for breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent misrepresentation, and violation of their prenup's disclosure requirements. Brian's own documents proved that he had systematically violated multiple provisions of their marital agreement, while using Jessica's trust and cooperation to further his deceptive schemes. As Jessica prepared for the next phase of her plan, she reflected on how completely Brian had underestimated both her capabilities and her determination. The woman he thought he was manipulating was actually documenting his every move, analyzing his financial strategies, and building a case that would demonstrate the full extent of his misconduct. The quiet teacher who had signed that prenup 4 years earlier had evolved into a formidable opponent who understood his weaknesses better than he understood hers. Brian Thompson was about to discover that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who have been systematically underestimated, and that the people who appear most trustworthy and supportive are sometimes the ones who are most capable of delivering devastating consequences when that trust is betrayed. Jessica's hidden arsenal of skills, knowledge, and evidence was about to transform her from victim to victor in a confrontation that Brian still didn't know was coming. Jessica's methodical approach to gathering evidence had revealed the full scope of Brian's financial deception, but she understood that documentation alone wouldn't be sufficient to achieve the justice she sought. The next phase of her plan required careful strategic thinking, precise timing, and the kind of patience that her years in education had taught her was essential for achieving lasting results. Brian's desperation was growing more obvious each day, and Jessica knew that his increasing recklessness would soon force a confrontation that would determine the future of their marriage and their financial security. The construction loan payments that Brian was struggling to meet were creating a cascade of financial pressures that he could no longer hide completely. Jessica noticed that he was receiving multiple calls each day from what appeared to be creditors and business associates, conversations that would send him into his office with the door closed, and his voice raised in what sounded like increasingly desperate negotiations. The monthly statements for their construction project showed carrying costs that were consuming most of Thompson Development Group's available cash, and Jessica could see that Brian and Patty were running out of options for maintaining their business operations. Jessica's analysis of the real estate market data confirmed what she suspected about the timing of Brian's financial crisis. The Phoenix housing market had been softening for months, with inventory levels rising and average days on market increasing substantially. Properties that had been selling within weeks during the boom were now sitting unsold for months, creating cash flow problems for developers who had borrowed heavily against expected quick sales. Brian's business model had been based on rapid turnover and quick profits, but the market conditions were no longer supporting that strategy. The partnership between Brian and Patty was showing serious signs of strain as their financial situation deteriorated. Jessica had overheard enough phone conversations to understand that Patty was questioning some of Brian's recent decisions and was demanding more transparency about their overall financial position. Brian's efforts to hide his personal debts from his business partner were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, especially as those debts began to affect his ability to contribute his share of capital to ongoing projects. Jessica realized that Brian's relationship with Patty represented both an opportunity and a potential complication in her plans. If Patty discovered the true extent of Brian's personal financial problems, she might take actions that could protect the business assets, but also make them less accessible to Jessica's claims under Article 26. Alternatively, if Jessica could demonstrate to Patty that Brian's hidden debts were affecting the partnership, Patty might become an ally in efforts to hold Brian accountable for his deceptive behavior. The legal research that Jessica had been conducting with Marcus Chen had revealed several strategic options for enforcing the penalty clause in Article 26, each with different timelines, costs, and potential outcomes. The most direct approach would be to file for divorce and seek immediate enforcement of the asset forfeiture provisions, but this would alert Brian to Jessica's knowledge of his situation and give him time to hide or transfer assets before the legal process could secure them. A more subtle approach would involve triggering the penalty clause through a formal demand for financial disclosure, requiring Brian to provide complete documentation of all his debts and obligations. If Brian refused to comply or provided false information, this would strengthen Jessica's case for penalty enforcement while also creating additional grounds for legal action. The discovery process in this approach would also allow Jessica to obtain documents and information that Brian had been hiding, potentially revealing even more serious misconduct than she had already discovered. Marcus had explained to Jessica that Arizona's community property laws created additional complications in cases involving business partnerships and personal guarantees. While the penalty clause in Article 26 could transfer Brian's separate assets to Jessica, the community property aspects of their marriage meant that some of Brian's debts could potentially become Jessica's responsibility, regardless of the prenup provisions. The key to protecting Jessica's interests would be demonstrating that Brian's debts were separate obligations that he had concealed from her, rather than community debts that they had incurred together. The evidence that Jessica had gathered supported this position strongly. Brian's personal credit cards, private investor loans, and undisclosed business guarantees were all separate obligations that he had incurred without Jessica's knowledge or consent. The fact that he had actively concealed these debts from her would help establish that they were not community obligations and that Jessica should not be held responsible for Brian's fraudulent financial behavior. Jessica's accounting analysis had also revealed potential claims against Brian for damages beyond the asset forfeiture provisions in Article 26. His use of their joint credit cards for undisclosed business expenses had created personal liability for Jessica that she hadn't agreed to accept. His refinancing of their house to obtain cash for his business had reduced Jessica's equity in their primary asset without her informed consent. His personal guarantees on business loans had put their community property at risk without Jessica's awareness or approval. The psychological toll of maintaining her facade of normalcy while secretly preparing for legal action was enormous. But Jessica had learned to manage her emotions by focusing on the concrete tasks that needed to be completed. She continued teaching with the same dedication and professionalism that had characterized her entire career, partly because she loved her work, and partly because she knew that maintaining her professional reputation would be important for her future financial security. Jessica's students and colleagues had no idea that their calm, organized teacher was secretly documenting one of the most sophisticated cases of marital financial fraud that Marcus Chen had ever encountered. Jessica's ability to compartmentalize her personal crisis while maintaining her professional responsibilities demonstrated the kind of emotional strength and practical competence that Brian had never recognized or valued. The timeline for Jessica's confrontation with Brian was being driven partly by external factors beyond her control. The construction loans that Brian was struggling to service had specific deadlines and payment schedules that would force a financial crisis within the next few months, regardless of Jessica's actions. If Brian defaulted on these loans, the resulting foreclosure actions and business dissolution could make it much more difficult for Jessica to recover assets under Article 26. Marcus had advised Jessica that timing would be crucial for maximizing her recovery under the penalty clause. If she waited too long, Brian's creditors might seize assets that could otherwise be transferred to her under the prenup provisions. If she acted too quickly, Brian might have time to hide or transfer assets before the legal process could secure them. The optimal timing would involve coordinating her legal actions with Brian's financial deadlines to maximize pressure, while minimizing his options for avoiding consequences. Jessica decided that the most effective approach would be to force Brian to confront his situation on multiple fronts simultaneously. She would demand complete financial disclosure while also initiating legal proceedings to enforce Article 26, creating a situation where Brian would have to choose between admitting the full extent of his deception or facing escalating legal and financial consequences for his continued dishonesty. The final phase of Jessica's preparation involved assembling all the evidence she had gathered into a comprehensive presentation that would demonstrate the systematic nature of Brian's deception. She created detailed timelines showing how his debts had accumulated, financial analyses demonstrating the impact of his hidden obligations on their community property, and legal documentation supporting her claims under Article 26. Jessica's presentation was organized with the same attention to detail and logical structure that she brought to her lesson planning, but the stakes were far higher than any classroom assignment. The documents she had assembled told a story of financial recklessness, deliberate deception, and systematic violation of the trust and legal obligations that formed the foundation of their marriage. The confrontation that would determine the future of their relationship was carefully planned for maximum impact and minimum opportunity for Brian to evade responsibility. Jessica arranged for the meeting to take place in Marcus Chen's office, with all relevant documents already secured and legal proceedings ready to file immediately if Brian refused to cooperate with the asset transfer requirements of Article 26. Jessica had also taken steps to protect herself from potential retaliation or attempts by Brian to hide assets once he understood the full implications of his situation. She had moved her personal assets to separate accounts, documented the location and value of all community property, and prepared for the possibility that Brian might become desperate enough to attempt illegal or unethical actions to avoid the consequences of his behavior. On the morning of the confrontation, Jessica felt a calm clarity that reminded her of the feeling she had before important parent conferences or difficult classroom discussions. She had prepared thoroughly, understood all the relevant facts, and was ready to present her case with the same professional competence that had made her successful in every other aspect of her life. Brian arrived at Marcus Chen's office, expecting what he thought would be a routine discussion about their marriage and financial planning. Jessica had told him that she wanted to review their overall financial situation and discuss some concerns she had about their future security. Brian's confident demeanor suggested that he expected to be able to manage this conversation the same way he had been managing Jessica's concerns for years. The shock on Brian's face when Marcus began explaining Article 26's penalty provisions was immediately apparent. The color drained from his complexion as he realized that Jessica wasn't asking questions about their finances because she was confused or concerned. She was confronting him because she knew everything. The documents that Jessica had assembled were spread across the conference table, creating a visual representation of the systematic deception that had characterized their marriage for years. Brian's initial response was predictably defensive. He tried to minimize the significance of his debts, claiming that they were temporary business obligations that would be resolved once their current properties sold. He attempted to blame external factors like market conditions and regulatory changes for their financial problems. He even suggested that Jessica was overreacting to normal business challenges that she didn't understand because of her limited experience with real estate development. But Jessica's methodical presentation of evidence made it impossible for Brian to maintain his denials. The credit card statements, loan documents, and bank records painted a clear picture of deliberate concealment and systematic violation of their prenup's disclosure requirements. When Brian claimed that certain debts were legitimate business expenses, Jessica produced documentation showing that the money had been used for personal purposes or to cover previous debts rather than for actual business operations. The most devastating moment came when Jessica presented evidence of Brian's attempts to manipulate their joint assets to cover his personal obligations. The home equity loan that he had obtained without Jessica's knowledge had used their house as collateral for debts that Jessica had no legal or moral responsibility to cover. The joint credit card charges that were actually business expenses had made Jessica personally liable for Brian's professional obligations without her consent or awareness. Marcus explained to Brian that his concealment of over $300,000 in debts had automatically triggered Article 26's penalty provisions, resulting in immediate forfeiture of his separate assets to Jessica. The prenup that Brian had thought would protect his business interests and real estate investments from Jessica's potential claims had actually created a legal mechanism for transferring those same assets to her as compensation for his fraudulent behavior. Brian's attempts to negotiate or find alternative solutions were met with calm but firm resistance from both Jessica and Marcus. The penalty clause in Article 26 was not negotiable. It was an automatic consequence that had been triggered by Brian's own actions. The only remaining question was whether Brian would cooperate with the asset transfer process or force Jessica to pursue more aggressive legal remedies that could result in additional penalties and legal costs. The business partnership with Patty Williams became a crucial factor in the final resolution of Jessica's claims. When Patty learned about Brian's hidden personal debts and their potential impact on Thompson Development Group, she immediately moved to protect the business assets and her own financial interests. The partnership agreement included provisions that allowed Patty to buy out Brian's share of the business if his personal conduct threatened the company's financial stability. Patty's decision to exercise this buyout option actually worked to Jessica's advantage, since it converted Brian's business ownership into cash that could be more easily transferred under Article 26's penalty provisions. The business valuation process revealed that Thompson Development Group was worth significantly more than Brian's personal debts, meaning that Jessica would receive substantial compensation for the financial damage that Brian's deception had caused. The final settlement transferred not only Brian's business assets, but also his real estate investments, personal investment accounts, and even his precious BMW to Jessica's ownership. The house in Ahwatukee was refinanced to remove Brian's name from the mortgage, with Jessica qualifying for the new loan based on her teaching salary combined with the assets she had recovered under Article 26. Brian's attempts to challenge the penalty enforcement were unsuccessful, partly because of the clear evidence of his deception, and partly because his own lawyer had drafted the prenup provisions that made the asset forfeiture possible. Bob Anderson's careful legal work had created an ironclad mechanism for punishing exactly the kind of behavior that Brian had engaged in, and there were no loopholes or technicalities that could help Brian avoid the consequences of his actions. The divorce proceedings were completed within 6 months of Jessica's initial confrontation with Brian, a remarkably quick resolution for a case involving such complex financial issues. Brian's cooperation with the asset transfer process, motivated partly by his desire to avoid even more severe legal consequences, helped expedite the proceedings and minimize legal costs for both parties. Jessica emerged from the divorce with assets worth over $800,000, including the house, Brian's business interests, and various investment accounts that she had never known existed. Combined with her own savings and the equity in their home, Jessica found herself in a far stronger financial position than when she had married Brian 4 years earlier. But the most important outcome wasn't financial, it was personal. Jessica had proven to herself that she was capable of handling complex challenges, making difficult decisions, and protecting her own interests when necessary. The quiet teacher who had trusted her husband to manage their finances had evolved into a confident, independent woman who understood her own worth and capabilities. Jessica's experience with Brian's deception had also revealed strengths and skills that she hadn't fully appreciated in herself. Her analytical abilities, attention to detail, and capacity for strategic thinking had proved crucial for achieving justice and protecting her future. The education and professional experience that Brian had dismissed as insignificant had actually provided Jessica with exactly the tools she needed to defeat his sophisticated deception. The aftermath of the divorce brought unexpected opportunities for Jessica to help others who had experienced similar betrayals. Her success in enforcing Article 26's penalty provisions became a precedent that other attorneys began citing in cases involving marital financial fraud. Jessica found herself consulted by lawyers, financial advisors, and even legislators who were working to strengthen legal protections for victims of financial deception in marriage. Jessica decided to use her experience and recovered assets to create a nonprofit organization that would provide education and support for individuals dealing with financial deception in relationships. The Jessica Martinez Financial Literacy Foundation offered workshops on understanding prenups, recognizing signs of financial manipulation, and protecting personal assets in marriage. The foundation also provided legal assistance for victims of marital financial fraud who couldn't afford private attorneys. The teaching skills that had made Jessica successful in the classroom proved equally valuable in her new role as an advocate and educator. She could explain complex financial concepts in terms that ordinary people could understand, and her personal experience gave her credibility with audiences who had experienced similar betrayals. Her workshops filled quickly, and demand for her services grew rapidly as word spread about her unique combination of professional expertise and personal experience. Brian's fate was less encouraging. The loss of his business interests and personal assets left him unable to service his remaining debts, and he was forced to declare bankruptcy within a year of their divorce. The personal guarantees he had signed made it impossible for him to escape his obligations through corporate bankruptcy, and his financial reputation in the Phoenix real estate community was permanently damaged by the revelations about his deceptive practices. Patty Williams successfully rebuilt Thompson Development Group without Brian's involvement, demonstrating that his contribution to the business had been less essential than he had believed. The company's reputation recovered quickly once Patty distanced the business from Brian's personal financial problems, and she was able to complete the projects that had been endangered by Brian's hidden debts. Jessica's sister Elena moved back to Phoenix to help with the foundation's operations, bringing her marketing and communications skills to support Jessica's educational mission. The sisters had grown closer through Jessica's crisis, and Elena's support had been crucial during the most difficult periods of the divorce proceedings. 5 years after discovering Brian's deception, Jessica looked back on the experience as a painful but ultimately transformative period that had revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. The woman who had signed that prenup as a trusting newlywed had evolved into a confident advocate who helped others protect themselves from similar betrayals. The house in Ahwatukee had been renovated to serve as both Jessica's residence and the foundation's headquarters. The home office where she had first discovered Brian's lies had been converted into a resource center where visitors could access financial education materials and legal information. The space that had once represented deception and betrayal had been transformed into a symbol of empowerment and hope. Jessica continued teaching part-time, maintaining her connection to the profession that had given her purpose and identity before her marriage. But her primary focus was on the foundation's work, helping others understand the warning signs of financial manipulation and providing resources for those who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced. The prenup that Brian had thought would protect his assets had instead become the instrument of Jessica's liberation and the foundation of her new mission. Article 26's penalty provisions had not only provided justice in her specific case, but had also created a legal precedent that strengthened protections for other victims of marital financial fraud. Jessica's story became a powerful example of how knowledge, preparation, and determination could triumph over deception and manipulation. The quiet teacher who had been systematically underestimated had proven that the most dangerous opponents are often those who appear most vulnerable, and that trust betrayed can become the foundation for justice achieved. The transformation of Jessica's life in the months following Brian's defeat was remarkable not just for its financial implications, but for the profound personal growth that emerged from having successfully navigated such a complex and emotionally devastating crisis. The woman who had once signed documents without fully understanding their implications had become someone who could analyze legal contracts, assess financial risks, and make strategic decisions with confidence and precision. The quiet teacher who had deferred to her husband's supposed expertise had discovered that her own analytical abilities and professional judgment were far superior to his reckless opportunism and deceptive practices. Jessica's first major decision as an independent woman was how to handle the substantial assets she had recovered through Article 26's penalty provisions. The $800,000 in combined assets represented more money than she had ever imagined controlling, and the responsibility of managing such wealth felt overwhelming at times. But Jessica approached this challenge with the same methodical preparation that had enabled her to expose Brian's deception, researching investment strategies, consulting with financial advisors, and developing a comprehensive plan for preserving and growing her recovered assets. The house in Ahwatukee required significant renovations to transform it from a symbol of Brian's deception into a space that reflected Jessica's values and vision for her future. She hired contractors to convert Brian's former office into a bright, welcoming space that would serve as the foundation's resource center. The safe where Brian had hidden his loan documents was removed and replaced with built-in bookshelves filled with financial literacy materials, legal guides, and educational resources that visitors could use to understand their own rights and options. Jessica's decision to continue teaching part-time while building the foundation reflected her understanding that maintaining connections to her original profession would keep her grounded and provide perspective on the broader impact of her advocacy work. Her students and colleagues at Desert View Elementary knew nothing about the dramatic changes in her personal life, but they noticed that she seemed more confident and assertive in faculty meetings and parent conferences. The skills Jessica had developed in confronting Brian's deception translated directly into her ability to handle difficult parents, advocate for her students' needs, and navigate the complex politics of public education. The legal precedent established by Jessica's successful enforcement of Article 26's penalty provisions began attracting attention from attorneys across Arizona and beyond. Marcus Chen received numerous calls from lawyers seeking guidance on similar cases, and several law firms began incorporating similar penalty clauses into the prenups they drafted for clients. Jessica found herself consulted as an expert witness in cases involving marital financial fraud, using her experience and analytical abilities to help other victims document and prove their claims. The Foundation's educational workshops grew rapidly in popularity as word spread about Jessica's unique combination of personal experience and professional expertise. The initial sessions were held in her home's renovated resource center, but demand quickly exceeded the space's capacity. Jessica began renting conference rooms at local hotels and community centers, eventually establishing a regular schedule of monthly workshops that consistently attracted 30 to 40 participants. The attendees at Jessica's workshops represented a diverse cross-section of Phoenix's population, but they shared common experiences of financial manipulation, deception, and abuse within their relationships. Many were women who had discovered hidden debts, secret accounts, or undisclosed business obligations that put their family's security at risk. Others were individuals who suspected financial misconduct, but lacked the knowledge or resources to investigate their concerns effectively. Jessica's teaching background proved invaluable in designing educational content that could make complex financial and legal concepts accessible to people without specialized training. She developed interactive exercises that helped participants identify warning signs of financial manipulation, understand their legal rights in various situations, and create action plans for protecting their interests. The workshops included practical components like document organization, evidence gathering, and communication strategies for confronting suspected financial misconduct. One of the most powerful aspects of Jessica's workshops was her willingness to share specific details about her own experience with Brian's deception. She would walk participants through the timeline of her discovery process, showing them copies of the actual documents she had found, and explaining how she had used her accounting knowledge to analyze the financial information. This transparency helped attendees understand that they didn't need to be financial experts to protect themselves, but that careful attention to detail and systematic investigation could reveal even sophisticated deception. The Foundation's legal assistance program began modestly, with Jessica providing referrals to attorneys who had experience with marital financial fraud cases. But as the Foundation's resources grew, Jessica was able to establish relationships with several law firms that agreed to provide reduced-fee services for Foundation clients. The program also developed partnerships with accounting firms and financial planning organizations that could provide professional services at discounted rates for victims of financial abuse. Jessica's advocacy work brought her into contact with legislators and policymakers who were interested in strengthening legal protections for victims of marital financial fraud. She testified before state legislative committees about the need for clearer disclosure requirements in prenups, stronger penalties for financial deception in marriage, and better enforcement mechanisms for existing legal protections. Her combination of personal experience and professional credibility made her an effective advocate for policy changes that could help other victims achieve justice. The impact of Jessica's foundation extended beyond Arizona as she began receiving requests for consultation from organizations in other states. She developed online resources, including webinars and educational videos, that could reach audiences who couldn't attend her in-person workshops. The Foundation's website became a comprehensive resource for information about financial rights in marriage, warning signs of financial abuse, and strategies for documenting and responding to financial deception. Brian's downward spiral accelerated as the full consequences of his deceptive practices became apparent to his former business associates and social connections. The bankruptcy proceedings revealed additional debts and obligations that even Jessica hadn't discovered, painting a picture of financial recklessness that went far beyond what she had documented in her Article 26 case. Several of Brian's private investors filed lawsuits seeking to recover their losses, and his reputation in Phoenix real estate community was permanently damaged. The dissolution of Brian's relationship with his brother Danny was particularly painful, as Danny realized that he had been unknowingly complicit in Brian's deception by providing social support and credibility for Brian's false narrative of success. Danny's guilt about his role in enabling Brian's manipulation of Jessica led him to become one of the Foundation's early supporters, providing both financial contributions and volunteer assistance for educational programs. Patty Williams' successful rebuilding of Thompson Development Group without Brian's involvement demonstrated that his contribution to the business had been less essential than he had believed. Under Patty's sole leadership, the company developed a reputation for ethical business practices and transparent financial management that attracted both investors and clients who had been wary of working with the previous partnership. Patty's success provided a powerful counterpoint to Brian's claims that his aggressive and deceptive tactics had been necessary for business success. Jessica's relationship with her family deepened as her parents and sister Elena came to understand the full extent of what she had endured and accomplished. Her parents, who had initially been impressed by Brian's apparent success and generosity, were horrified to learn about his manipulation and deception. They became active supporters of the Foundation's work, contributing both financial resources and volunteer time to help other families avoid similar experiences. Elena's decision to relocate to Phoenix permanently was motivated partly by her desire to support Jessica's advocacy work, and partly by her recognition that the Foundation represented an opportunity to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. Elena's background in marketing and communications proved invaluable in expanding the Foundation's reach and developing professional materials that could effectively communicate complex information to diverse audiences. The Foundation's growth required Jessica to develop new skills in nonprofit management, fundraising, and organizational leadership. She enrolled in continuing education courses on nonprofit administration and sought mentorship from leaders of established advocacy organizations. The same analytical abilities that had enabled her to expose Brian's deception proved equally valuable in building effective systems for program delivery, volunteer management, and financial oversight. Jessica's personal relationships evolved significantly as she gained confidence and independence. The social circle she had shared with Brian, composed primarily of real estate professionals and their spouses, had largely abandoned her after the divorce became public knowledge. But Jessica discovered that she didn't miss the superficial conversations and competitive lifestyle displays that had characterized those relationships. Instead, she developed friendships with colleagues from the foundation, fellow advocates in related fields, and individuals who shared her commitment to social justice and education. The romantic relationship that Jessica eventually developed with Michael Santos, a fellow teacher who had attended one of her workshops after discovering his ex-wife's hidden credit card debts, was built on mutual respect, shared values, and complete financial transparency. Michael's own experience with financial deception had given him deep appreciation for Jessica's advocacy work and personal strength. Their relationship progressed slowly and carefully, with both partners committed to avoiding the mistakes and warning signs that had characterized their previous marriages. Jessica's decision to write a book about her experience was motivated by requests from workshop participants and fellow advocates who wanted to share her story with friends and family members who might be experiencing similar situations. The book, titled Article 26, How a Teacher Turned a Prenup into Justice, became a bestseller in the personal finance and self-help categories, reaching audiences far beyond the Foundation's direct programming. The book's success created new opportunities for Jessica to expand her advocacy work through speaking engagements, media appearances, and consulting relationships with other organizations. She appeared on national television programs, participated in radio interviews, and spoke at conferences for legal professionals, financial planners, and domestic violence advocates. Her story resonated with audiences because it demonstrated that ordinary people could overcome sophisticated manipulation and achieve justice through preparation, persistence, and strategic thinking. The Foundation's 5th anniversary celebration brought together over 200 people whose lives had been touched by Jessica's work. The event included former workshop participants who had successfully resolved their own financial disputes, legal professionals who had incorporated the Foundation's educational materials into their practices, and policymakers who had supported legislative changes inspired by Jessica's advocacy efforts. During her speech at the anniversary celebration, Jessica reflected on how her experience with Brian's deception had ultimately led to a more fulfilling and meaningful life than she could have imagined when she first signed that prenup. The betrayal that had seemed so devastating at the time had actually revealed strengths and capabilities that might have remained dormant if she had continued in her role as the supportive, trusting wife. Jessica's success in transforming her personal crisis into a platform for helping others demonstrated the potential for individual experiences of injustice to create broader social change. The Foundation's work had prevented countless other victims from suffering the kind of financial and emotional damage that Jessica had endured, and the legal precedents established by her case had strengthened protections for all victims of marital financial fraud. The house in Ahwatukee had been transformed from a symbol of deception into a beacon of hope and empowerment. The resource center that had replaced Brian's office was constantly busy with visitors seeking information, support, and guidance for their own situations. The space that had once housed documents meant to hide Brian's lies now contained resources designed to help others discover and confront similar deceptions in their own lives. Jessica's daily routine included time for teaching, foundation work, and personal reflection on the journey that had brought her to this point. The morning coffee ritual that had once been a quiet moment before facing another day of unknowing participation in Brian's deception had become a time for planning new initiatives, reviewing success stories from Foundation clients, and preparing for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The financial security that Jessica had achieved through the Article 26 penalty provisions provided a foundation for independence and advocacy that extended far beyond simple monetary value. The assets she had recovered from Brian's deception had been invested carefully and grown substantially, creating resources that could support the Foundation's work for decades to come. But more importantly, the experience of successfully managing those assets had given Jessica confidence in her ability to make sound financial decisions and build long-term security for herself and the causes she supported. The legacy of Jessica's confrontation with Brian extended beyond the immediate parties involved to influence legal practice, policy development, and social awareness of financial abuse in relationships. Law schools began including her case in curricula on family law and prenup drafting. Financial planning organizations incorporated her educational materials into their client services. Domestic violence prevention programs added financial literacy components inspired by the Foundation's work. 10 years after discovering Brian's hidden debts, Jessica looked back on that period as the beginning of her real life rather than the end of her marriage. The woman who had signed that prenup as a naive newlywed had evolved into a nationally recognized advocate whose work had changed laws, influenced professional practices, and helped thousands of people protect themselves from financial manipulation. The Foundation's work continued to expand, with satellite programs in other states and international inquiries about replicating the model in other countries. Jessica's story had become a symbol of how individual courage and determination could create systemic change, demonstrating that victims of financial abuse could not only recover from their experiences, but use those experiences to prevent others from suffering similar harm. Brian's attempts to rebuild his life and career had been largely unsuccessful, as his reputation for deception and financial irresponsibility made it difficult for him to attract investors or business partners. He had moved to a different city and attempted to start over in a new industry, but the legal records of his bankruptcy and the publicity surrounding Jessica's case followed him and limited his opportunities for professional rehabilitation. The contrast between Brian's continued struggles and Jessica's remarkable success illustrated the long-term consequences of choosing deception over honesty, manipulation over partnership, and short-term gain over sustainable relationships. Brian's cleverness in hiding his debts and manipulating his wife had ultimately destroyed his career, his relationships, and his reputation, while Jessica's patience and integrity had created a foundation for lasting success and meaningful contribution to society. As Jessica prepared for the next phase of the Foundation's development, which would include establishing an endowment to ensure permanent funding for educational programs, she reflected on the unexpected ways that life's most challenging experiences could become sources of strength and purpose. The prenup that Brian had intended as a shield for his deception had become the sword of Jessica's justice, and the woman he had systematically underestimated had become his most formidable opponent and ultimate downfall. The story of Article 26 and its hidden asset penalties had become more than just a legal case or a personal triumph. It had become a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been underestimated, manipulated, or betrayed by someone they trusted. Jessica's journey from victim to victor to advocate demonstrated that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that the most powerful revenge is often the success that comes from refusing to be defined by someone else's failures and limitations. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Jessica's renovated home office as she reviewed the latest quarterly report from the Jessica Martinez Financial Literacy Foundation. 15 years had passed since that pivotal moment in Marcus Chen's law office when Brian's world had crumbled before his eyes, and the ripple effects of that confrontation continued to expand in ways that neither Jessica nor Brian could have anticipated. The foundation, now operated in 12 states, had helped over 10,000 individuals navigate financial deception cases, and had fundamentally changed how legal professionals approached prenup drafting and marital financial fraud cases. Jessica's influence on family law had evolved far beyond her original case. Law schools across the country now taught courses specifically focused on financial transparency in marriage, using Jessica's experience as a foundational case study. The Martinez Standard had become shorthand in legal circles for prenup clauses that included comprehensive disclosure requirements and meaningful penalties for financial deception. Young attorneys were trained to look for the warning signs that Jessica had identified and to draft protective language that could prevent the kind of systematic manipulation that Brian had employed. The Foundation's research department, established in year 7 of its operation, had published groundbreaking studies on the psychological patterns of financial abuse and the long-term economic impact of marital deception. These studies had influenced policy at the federal level, contributing to legislation that strengthened disclosure requirements for certain types of business loans and personal guarantees. The data that Jessica's team had collected demonstrated that financial abuse was far more common than previously understood, affecting an estimated 30% of marriages to some degree. Brian's story had become a cautionary tale that resonated far beyond the Phoenix real estate community where it had begun. Business schools now used his case as an example of how personal character flaws could destroy professional success, and how short-term thinking could create long-term catastrophic consequences. His name appeared in ethics courses, risk management seminars, and entrepreneur workshops as a reminder that sustainable success required honesty, transparency, and genuine partnership, rather than manipulation and deception. The psychological profile that emerged from Brian's downfall had become a template for identifying potentially destructive behavior patterns in business partnerships and marital relationships. Mental health professionals had identified the combination of narcissistic tendencies, financial recklessness, and systematic deception that Brian had exhibited as a recognizable syndrome that could be treated with appropriate intervention. Several of Jessica's workshop participants had used this framework to convince family members to seek professional help before their situations reached crisis levels. Jessica's personal life had stabilized into a pattern of meaningful work, strong relationships, and financial security that would have seemed impossible during her years with Brian. Her marriage to Michael Santos had been built on the foundation of complete transparency that Jessica now advocated for all couples. Their joint financial planning sessions were conducted with the same rigor that Jessica brought to her professional work, ensuring that both partners understood every aspect of their shared economic life. The couple's decision to remain childless had been influenced partly by Jessica's commitment to her advocacy work, and partly by their shared recognition that their combined experiences with financial trauma had created emotional complexities that might not be fair to pass on to children. Instead, they had channeled their nurturing instincts into mentoring young adults who had experienced financial abuse in their families of origin, helping them develop healthy relationship patterns and financial management skills. Michael's contribution to the foundation had grown over the years, from volunteer support to co-leadership of several key programs. His background in education and his personal experience with financial deception made him an effective workshop facilitator and counselor for male victims of financial abuse, a population that was often overlooked in discussions of marital financial fraud. His work had helped establish support groups specifically designed for men who had been financially manipulated by their partners. The Foundation's annual conference had become a major event in the family law and financial planning communities, attracting hundreds of professionals and thousands of participants each year. The conference featured workshops on legal strategies, therapeutic approaches to financial trauma, and policy advocacy techniques. It also included a ceremony honoring individuals who had achieved significant victories in financial abuse cases, creating a community of survivors who could support and learn from each other. Jessica's keynote speech at the most recent conference had focused on the evolution of her understanding of justice and revenge. She had explained how her initial desire for personal vindication had gradually transformed into a commitment to systemic change that could prevent others from experiencing similar betrayals. The distinction between seeking justice for oneself and creating justice for others had become a central theme in her advocacy work and personal philosophy. The legal precedent established by Jessica's Article 26 case had been cited in over 200 subsequent court decisions, creating a body of jurisprudence that consistently upheld the principle that financial deception in marriage should carry meaningful consequences. Judges had repeatedly ruled that prenup penalty clauses were enforceable when they addressed genuine misconduct, and that victims of financial abuse deserved compensation beyond simple asset division. Brian's attempts at professional rehabilitation had been consistently thwarted by the permanent record of his deceptive practices and the ongoing publicity surrounding Jessica's advocacy work. His story was frequently referenced in business media as an example of how personal failures could destroy professional opportunities, making it nearly impossible for him to attract investors or partners for new ventures. The few attempts he had made to restart his career had failed when potential associates discovered his history during routine background checks. The isolation that Brian experienced as a result of his reputation had created a downward spiral that affected every aspect of his life. His relationship with his family had never recovered from the revelations about his treatment of Jessica and his systematic deception. His brother Danny had maintained minimal contact, primarily to ensure that Brian was receiving adequate mental health support, but had made it clear that trust could never be fully restored. Brian's financial situation had stabilized at a level far below his previous lifestyle, but adequate for basic needs. He had found work in construction management, using skills from his family background that predated his real estate development career. The irony that he had returned to the same type of work his father had done was not lost on those who remembered his earlier ambitions and pretensions. The psychological impact of his downfall had required ongoing therapeutic intervention, as Brian struggled to accept responsibility for the consequences of his choices, while also dealing with the depression and anxiety that resulted from his social and professional isolation. His therapists had noted that his case represented an extreme example of how narcissistic behavior patterns could create self-destructive cycles that ultimately destroyed the very success they were intended to protect. Jessica's transformation from victim to advocate had inspired similar organizations in other countries, with foundations modeled on her approach operating in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. The international dimension of financial abuse had become increasingly apparent as global economic integration created new opportunities for cross-border deception and manipulation. Jessica had testified before international bodies about the need for coordinated responses to financial crimes that crossed national boundaries. The technological dimension of financial abuse had also evolved significantly since Jessica's original case, with digital banking, cryptocurrency, and online investment platforms creating new opportunities for deception and new challenges for detection. The Foundation had adapted its educational programs to address these emerging threats, developing resources that helped people understand and protect themselves from technologically sophisticated forms of financial manipulation. Jessica's book had been translated into 8 languages and had sold over 1 million copies worldwide, making her story accessible to audiences that might never attend a workshop or visit the Foundation's website. The book's success had created additional revenue streams that supported the Foundation's expansion and ensured its long-term financial sustainability. The royalties had been structured as donations to the Foundation, reflecting Jessica's commitment to using her personal success for broader social benefit. The media attention that continued to surround Jessica's story had evolved from sensational coverage of her divorce to serious journalistic examination of financial abuse as a social issue. Major news organizations regularly consulted her as an expert source for stories about marital financial fraud, prenup enforcement, and related legal developments. Her media appearances had consistently focused on education and prevention rather than personal vindication, reinforcing her role as an advocate rather than simply a survivor. The academic research that had grown out of Jessica's case had contributed to a broader understanding of economic abuse as a form of domestic violence that could be as damaging as physical or emotional abuse. Social workers, therapists, and legal professionals had been trained to recognize financial manipulation as a warning sign of other forms of abuse, leading to earlier intervention and better outcomes for victims. The policy changes that had resulted from Jessica's advocacy work included stronger disclosure requirements for prenups, mandatory financial literacy education in high schools, and enhanced penalties for certain types of financial fraud in marriage. These changes had created a legal and social environment where Brian's type of behavior was less likely to succeed and more likely to face serious consequences. As Jessica reflected on the 15 years since her confrontation with Brian, she recognized that the justice she had achieved extended far beyond the asset recovery that had initially motivated her legal action. The real victory had been the transformation of her personal experience into a force for social change that had prevented countless others from suffering similar betrayals. The prenup that Brian had intended as a tool of control had become an instrument of empowerment for thousands of people who had learned from Jessica's example. The Foundation's latest initiative involved working with technology companies to develop digital tools that could help people detect and document financial deception more easily. These tools used artificial intelligence and data analysis techniques to identify suspicious patterns in financial records, making it possible for non-experts to uncover sophisticated fraud schemes. The development of these tools represented the next evolution in the Foundation's mission to democratize access to financial protection and justice. Brian's legacy had become a permanent reminder that intelligence without integrity Ambition without ethics and success without honesty ultimately led to failure and isolation. His story served as a warning to others who might be tempted to use manipulation and deception to achieve their goals, demonstrating that such tactics could backfire catastrophically when confronted by someone with the knowledge, determination, and resources to fight back effectively. Jessica's legacy, by contrast, had become a symbol of how personal trauma could be transformed into social progress, how individual courage could create systemic change, and how the most powerful form of justice was often the prevention of similar injustices against others. The foundation that had grown from her desire for personal vindication had become a permanent institution that would continue protecting people from financial abuse long after Jessica's own involvement ended. The ripple effects of that confrontation in Marcus Chen's office continued to expand, touching lives and changing outcomes in ways that neither Jessica nor Brian could have imagined when they first signed that prenup 20 years earlier. The document that was meant to protect Brian's assets had instead become the foundation for Jessica's transformation and the catalyst for a movement that had changed how society understood and responded to financial abuse in relationships. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.